The Qing Dynasty, the final imperial dynasty in China. The Qing Dynasty, officially known as the Great Qing, was a Manchu-led imperial dynasty of China that was founded in 1616 and ruled China from 1664 until the Xinhai Revolution, which began in October 1911. At the height of its power, the Qing Empire extended from the Sea of Japan in the east to the Pamir Mountains in the west, and from its northern boundary of the Mongolian Plateau to the South China Sea. The dynasty originally emerged from the Later Jin dynasty in 1616, proclaimed in Shenyang 20 years later, before seizing control of the Ming capital of Beijing and thus northern China in 1644, which was considered the beginning of the dynasty's rule. The outbreak of the Xinhai Revolution in October 1911 led to the abdication of the last emperor in February 1912. The multi-ethnic Qing dynasty formed the territorial base for modern China, with the Qing controlling more territory than any of China's previous dynasties. In 1790, the Qing Empire was the fourth largest empire in world history at that time, and in 1907, with a population of more than 426 million citizens, it was the world's most populous country at that time. Historical overview. Nahashi, the leader of the Jiangzhou Jurchens, part of the House of Aisen-Gyoro and a vassal of the Ming dynasty, unified the Jurchen clans, later to be known as the Manchus, and founded the Later Jin dynasty in 1616, while renouncing the Ming overlords. As the founding Khan of the Manchu state, Nahashi established the Eight Banners military system, and his son Hong Taiji was declared emperor of the Great Qing in 1636. As Ming control disintegrated, peasant rebels captured Beijing under the short-lived Shun dynasty, but then the Ming general Wu Sangui opened the Shanhai Pass to the Qing army, thus defeated the rebels before seizing the capital for themselves, taking over the government in 1644 under the control of the Shunzi emperor and his prince regent. The Qing taking full control of China was delayed as the Ming regimes offered some resistance, including the revolt of the three feudatories that delayed the complete conquest until 1683, when it was declared the beginning of the High Qing era. The Kangxi emperor of Manchu ethnic origin consolidated control while relishing the role of the Confucian ruler, patronizing Buddhism, encouraging scholarship while supporting the growth of the population and economy. Officials of Han ethnicity worked under or parallel with Manchu officials. The Qing leveraged and adapted the traditional tributary system to maintain control over its neighbors, principally Joseon Korea, the Le dynasty in Vietnam, and Inner Asia, which included Tibet, Mongolia, and Xinjiang. The Qing dynasty reached its height during the reign of the Qianlong emperor, who led the 10 great campaigns of conquest, in addition to supervising Confucian cultural projects. After the death of the Qianlong emperor in 1796, the dynasty faced internal revolts, economic disruption, corruption by officials, foreign intrusion, and the reluctance of Confucian elites to alter their mindset. Following the defeat of China in the Opium Wars, Western colonial powers forced the Qing government to sign unequal treaties which granted those colonial powers trading privileges and treaty ports under their control. The Taiping Rebellion of 1850 until 1864, followed by the Dungan Revolt of 1862 until 1877, led to the deaths of over 20 million people from the effects of famine, disease, and war. The Tongzhi Restoration of the 1860s brought about vigorous reforms which included the introduction of foreign military technology in the self-strengthening movement. The defeat in the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894-5 led to the loss of control of Korea as well as the cession of Taiwan to the Japanese Empire. The 100 Days Reform in 1898 was an ambitious proposal for fundamental change that was poorly executed and eventually terminated by the Empress Dowager Cixi during the Wushu coup. In the year 1900, anti-foreign boxers killed numerous Chinese Christians and foreign missionaries. In an act of retaliation, the Eight-Nation Alliance invaded China, imposing a punitive indemnity. The Chinese government, in response, initiated unprecedented reforms, including elections, a new legal code, and the abolition of the imperial examination system. Sun Yat-sen and other revolutionaries debated with reform officials and monarchists over how to transform the Manchu-ruled empire into a modernized Han state. After the deaths of the Guangxu Emperor and Empress Dowager Cixi in 1908, Manchu officials blocked reforms and alienated those in favor of reform. The Wuchang Uprising that began on the 10th of October 1911 led to the Xinhai Revolution, which saw the Xuantong Emperor abdicating on the 12th of February 1912, bringing an end to the Qing Dynasty and the end of Imperial China. Formation of the Qing Dynasty. The Qing Dynasty was not founded by the majority Han Chinese, but by the Manchus, a sedentary farming people that descended from the Jurchens, a Tungusic people who originated from what is now the Chinese provinces of Jilin and Heilongjiang. The Manchu state was founded by Nahachi, the chieftain of a minor Jurchen clan, the Isengyoro, in Jiangzhou in the early 17th century. Fluent in Chinese and Mongolian, Nahachi had spent part of his youth in Han households and read a number of Chinese novels such as Romance of the Three Kingdoms and Water Margin. Nahachi considered himself a guardian of the Ming border, a local representative of his Ming overlords. An intertribal feud in 1582 led to a campaign to unify the Jurchen tribes, which brought Nahachi to control those factions. By 1616, he proclaimed himself Khan of the Later Jin Dynasty, a reference to the earlier Jurchen Jin Dynasty that ruled northern China. Nahachi announced the 7 grievances in an attempt to renounce the Ming sovereignty and complete the unification of the Jurchen tribes. After a series of successful battles, he relocated his capital, captured former Ming cities of Liaoyang in 1621, before moving to Mukden, today known as Shenyang, in 1625. Nahachi died the following year and was succeeded by his 8th son, Hong Taiji, an experienced leader. After a defeat in 1627 due to the Ming's use of Portuguese cannons, Hong Taiji created his own corps of artillery, and by 1634 they were casting their own cannons in the European style, having gained knowledge through defectors. A defining moment for Hong Taiji was in 1635, adopting the name Manchus for the unified Jurchen people. When Hong Taiji was presented with the imperial seal of the Yuan dynasty, he renamed his state from Great Qing to the Great Qing, elevating his role from Khan to emperor. Many of the bureaucratic positions of his eventual government were staffed by Han Chinese, even employing surrendered Ming officials in some capacity. Despite this, he ensured Manchu dominance in his top appointments. His policy was for Han Chinese that assimilated to the Jurchen before 1619 to be treated equally, and by 1648 less than 1/6 of his bannermen were of Manchu ancestry. Claiming the mandate of heaven. Hong Taiji died in September 1643 with no clear successor, as Jurchen leaders were generally chosen by a council of nobles. Hong Taiji's oldest son, Huge, and Hong Taiji's half-brother, Dogon, were the leading contenders. However, a compromise saw Hong Taiji's 5-year-old son Fulin installed as the Shunzi emperor, with Dogon acting as regent and de facto leader of the Manchu nation. The Ming government, in the last vestiges of power, fought against fiscal collapse, a series of peasant rebellions, and against each other. The Ming were unable to capitalize on the Manchu succession dispute and resulting boy emperor. In April 1644, Beijing was sacked by a rebel coalition led by Li Zicheng, who established the short-lived Qing Dynasty. The last Ming ruler, the Qing Emperor, committed suicide when Beijing fell to the rebels, effectively marking the end of that dynasty. Li Zicheng then led his approximately 200,000 rebel forces to confront Ming general Wu Sangui at the Shenyang Pass of the Great Wall, positioned there to defend the capital from the approaching Manchu armies. Wu had a decision to make: which of his adversaries to ally himself with, in which to survive. In the past, Li had taken Wu's father hostage, in addition to taking Wu's concubine for himself, while the Manchus had adopted a Chinese form of government and a greater opportunity for stability. Wu, allied with the Manchus under Dogon, defeated Li Zicheng at the Battle of Shenyang Pass on the 27th of May, 1644. These new allied armies then captured Beijing on the 6th of June, and the Shunzi emperor was invested as the Son of Heaven on the 30th of October. The Manchus held a formal funeral for the Qing emperor, although the conquest of all of China took another 17 years in defeating rebels and Ming loyalists. The last Ming pretender, Prince Gui, sought refuge with the King of Burma, but was turned over to a Qing expeditionary force commanded by Wu Sangui. Prince Gui was brought back to Yunnan before he was executed in 1662. The first 7 years of the Shunzi emperor's reign were dominated by Dogon, who because of his political insecurity ruled in the name of the emperor at the expense of his rival Manchu princes, demoting or imprisoning any he felt were rivals to his power. One positive for Dogon was that he insisted Beijing was not sacked, as had happened to the losing capital in all previous dynasties. Dogon, in installing the Qing in the former Ming capital, helped stabilize the regime as well as eased the conquest throughout the rest of the country. Not all of his policies were popular, including the controversial Q Order of July 1645 that forced Han Chinese men to shave the front of their heads and combed what remained into the Q hairstyle worn by Manchu men, or face execution. The popular description of this order was: to keep the hair, you lose the head; to keep your head, you cut the hair. This order was seen by the Manchus as a test of loyalty and to seek out friend from foe. But for the Han Chinese, it was a humiliating reminder of Qing authority and a challenge to their traditional Confucian values. The order was resisted in Jiangnan. In the ensuing unrest, around 100,000 Han Chinese were slaughtered. Dogon died suddenly on the 31st of December 1650, but because the Shunzi emperor was still only 12 years old at the time, most decisions were made on his behalf by his mother, the Empress Dowager Xiaozhuang, a skilled political operator. Dogon, in his final years, had become a direct threat to the rule of Shunzi. Yet despite this, Dogon was given the posthumous title of Emperor Yi, the only occasion in Qing history in which a Manchu was so honored. 2 months into Shunzi's reign, under his mother's supervision, Dogon was stripped of those newly appointed titles. His corpse was disinterred and mutilated. The fall from grace of Dogon led to a purge on his family and court associates. The promising rule of Shunzi was cut short when he died in 1661 of smallpox at the age of 24. He was succeeded by his third son, Xuanyi, who reigned as the Kangxi Emperor. Kangxi Emperor's reign and consolidation. The Kangxi Emperor's reign extended over 61 years, making his reign the longest of any emperor in Chinese history and marked the beginning of the High Qing era, the high point of the dynasty's social, economic and military power. Among the reasons for this successful period were the Manchu rulers and Han Chinese official elites coming to terms with each other with the examination system, enabling Han Chinese to become officials. Another aspect of the stability was the Manchu rulers appearing to the Mongol, Tibetan and Muslim subjects as China accepted its multi-ethnic empire. While the Qing used the title of emperor, they also used Son of Heaven, with the Qianlong emperor even portraying himself as a Buddhist sage ruler, in addition to being a patron of Tibetan Buddhism. To Mongol subjects, each Qing emperor was referred to as Bogda Khan, while Turkic Muslims, now known as Uyghurs, referred to the Qing ruler as the Chinese Khagan. Kangxi's reign began at the age of 7, and to avoid a repeat of the situation surrounding Dogon's monopolizing power on his deathbed, Kangxi's father appointed 4 regents that were not closely related to the imperial family and thus had no claim to the throne. However, Oboi, the most junior of the 4 regents, gradually gained enough dominance to become a threat. In 1669, Kangxi ordered that Oboi be disarmed and imprisoned. This became a significant moral victory for the 15-year-old emperor. Kangxi, in his early years of rule, faced several challenges in maintaining his control of the kingdom, including the threat of 3 former Ming generals that had been granted governorships in southern China. In what became known as the Revolt of the 3 Feudatories, lasting 8 years, Kangxi was able to unify his armies under a new generation of Manchu generals that had overcome the main threat by 1681, although complete control over southern China took several decades to be achieved. The Kangxi Emperor led military campaigns into Outer Mongolia and Taiwan, and then defeating the far eastern outpost of the Tsardom of Russia, creating the Treaty of Nerchinsk, which was China's first formal treaty with a European power and kept good border relations for the better part of the next 2 centuries. After the death of Galdan in the Dzugar Qing War, his Tibetan Buddhist followers attempted to control the appointment of the next Dalai Lama. However, Kangxi dispatched 2 armies to the Tibetan capital of Lhasa, installing a Dalai Lama who was sympathetic to the Qing. Reigns of the Yongzheng and Qianlong emperors. While the Kangxi Emperor's reign was thought of as the rise of Qing power, the reigns of his son, the Yongzheng Emperor, and grandson, the Qianlong Emperor, were the height of Qing power. The Qianlong Emperor reigned for 60 years before abdicating so as not to remove the glory of the 61-year reign of his grandfather. The empire, by the end of the Qianlong Emperor's long reign, was showing signs of decay, and the eventual collapse were becoming apparent. After the death of the Kangxi Emperor in the winter of 1722, his 4th son, Prince Yong, became the Yongzheng Emperor. Yongzheng promoted Confucian orthodoxy while cracking down on what he considered to be unorthodox sects. In 1723, he outlawed Christianity and expelled Christian missionaries. He expanded on his father's system of palace memorials, which brought detailed reports on local conditions directly to the palace without first being intercepted by the bureaucrats, and created a council of personal advisors which eventually grew into the de facto cabinet for the rest of the dynasty. Key positions were shrewdly filled with a combination of Manchu and Han officials. Yongzheng had rejected his father's more lenient approach and enforced a vigorous collection of land taxes when he discovered the extent of the financial crisis facing the dynasty. The increased revenues were to be used for money to nourish honesty among local officials, to be used locally on irrigation projects, schools, roads, and charity. These reforms were effective in the north, but in the south there were long-established networks of officials and landowners using falsified land registers and accounts. Experienced officials were sent in to penetrate the problem, and a fiscal crisis erupted among the tricks, passivity, and violence they encountered. The Yongzheng Emperor died in 1735, leaving his son, Prince Bao, to become the Qianlong Emperor. Qianlong personally led the 10 great campaigns that expanded military control into what is today Xinjiang and Mongolia, quelling revolts and uprisings in Sichuan and southern China while expanding control over Tibet. The Qianlong Emperor launched several ambitious cultural projects. This included the compilation of the Siku Quanshu, the largest collection of books in Chinese history, while using literary inquisition to silence any opposition. Despite the era largely being one of outward prosperity and imperial confidence, the later years of Qianlong's reign were remembered for rampant corruption and neglect. Heshan, the emperor's handsome young favorite, took advantage of the emperor's indulgences to become one of the most corrupt officials in the dynasty's history. Qianlong's son, the Qing Emperor, later forced Heshan to commit suicide. During the first half of the 17th century, the population numbers did not recover after periods of civil war and epidemics, although later in that century, following years of prosperity and stability, saw steady growth in the population figures. The introduction of new crops, such as potatoes and peanuts from the Americas, improved levels of nutrition so that by the mid-18th century, the population rose rapidly from 100 million to around 300 million. One drawback for farmers was they were forced to work ever-decreasing smallholdings with more intensity. The White Lotus Society raised open rebellion in 1796, claiming the officials forced people to rebel, while others blamed officials for corruption, poor maintenance of roads and waterworks, and not conducting correct famine relief supplies. This was followed by uprisings by new sect Muslims against the officials and an uprising by Miao tribesmen in southwest China. The White Lotus Rebellion, as it became known, continued until 1804, when it was ended despite badly run, corrupt and brutal campaigns. Rebellion, unrest and external pressure. During the 18th century, European empires gradually expanded across the world, developing economies based on maritime trade, colonial extraction, as well as through technological advances. The Qing Dynasty was faced with the newly developing concepts of the international system and state-to-state relations. European trading posts and territorial control expanded into what is now India and Indonesia. The Qing responded to this growing threat by establishing the Canton system in 1756, which restricted maritime trade to Guangzhou, giving the monopoly of trading rights to private Chinese merchants. This was successful for a time, with the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company having been given similar monopoly trading rights by their respective governments. The British East India Company, with the support of the British government, sent a diplomatic mission to China in 1793, led by Lord Macartney, with the intention of opening trade and put relations on a basis of equality. However, the imperial court viewed trade as not that important, whereas the British saw maritime trade as key to their economy. Lord Macartney was told by the Qianlong Emperor, "The kings of the myriad nations come by land and sea with all sorts of precious things, and, consequently, there is nothing we lack." Since China had little demand for European goods, Europeans had to pay for Chinese goods in silver, an imbalance that concerned mercantilist governments of both Britain and France. However, the growing demand in China for opium provided the remedy. The British East India Company greatly expanded production of this crop in Bengal, and this concerned the Daguan Emperor as damage being caused by opium smoking to his people, and the lower trade in silver led to an order to end this trade. Lin Zexu, having been ordered to end the trade in opium, confiscated stocks without compensation in 1839. This led to Britain sending a military expedition the following year and the outbreak of the First Opium War. The war revealed the outdated equipment of the Chinese military at that time. The Qing Navy, with their wooden sailing junks, were no match for the modern tactics and firepower of the British Royal Navy. The British, using advanced muskets and artillery, easily outgunned the Qing forces in any battle that broke out, with the Qing surrendering in 1842 when they signed the Treaty of Nanjing, the first of the unequal treaties that demanded war reparations, while forcing China to open up the treaty ports of Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai to Western trade and missionaries. Hong Kong was also ceded to the British in what were considered weaknesses within the Qing government, which eventually provoked rebellions against the regime. The Taiping Rebellion that occurred from 1849 until 1864 was the first major anti-Manchu movement. It occurred amid widespread social unrest and worsening famine that posed the most serious threat to the rule of the Qing Empire. During the course of the revolt, an estimated 20 to 30 million people lost their lives. The rebellion began under the leadership of Hong Xiuquan, a failed civil servant examination candidate who, having been influenced by reading translated versions of the Old Testament, claimed to have a series of visions and thus claimed he was the Son of God and the younger brother of Jesus Christ, and ultimately sent to reform China. In 1851, Hong launched an uprising in Guizhou, and in doing so established the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom and announced himself as king. Within his kingdom, he announced slavery, the practice of concubines, arranged marriages, opium smoking, foot binding, judicial torture, and the worship of idols were all forbidden. Hong's initial success led to internal feuds, defections, and corruption. British and French soldiers came to the assistance of the Qing army. However, it was not until 1864 that the revolt was finally crushed. After the outbreak of this rebellion, there were further uprisings, including revolts by Muslims and the Miao people against the Qing, the most notable uprisings being the Miao rebellions in Guizhou, the Pantai rebellion in Yunnan, and the Dungan revolt in the northwest. The Western powers, largely unsatisfied with the Treaty of Nanjing, grudgingly gave support to the Qing government during these rebellions, while China's income fell sharply as large areas of farmland were destroyed, millions of lives were lost, and countless armies were raised to fight the rebels. In 1854, in an effort to renegotiate the Treaty of Nanjing, Britain inserted clauses that allowed British commercial access to Chinese rivers, while also creating a permanent British embassy in Beijing. 2 years later, in 1856, Qing authorities, while searching for a pirate, boarded a ship, the Arrow, which the British claimed had been flying the British flag, and this incident sparked off the Second Opium War. In 1858, with no other option, the Xianfeng Emperor agreed to sign the Treaty of Tientsin, which contained clauses that were deeply insulting to the Chinese and demanded all official Chinese documents to be written in English, while giving British warships unlimited access to all of China's navigable rivers. Ratification of the treaty the following year led to a resumption of hostilities, with, in 1860, Anglo-French forces marching on Beijing, with the Emperor and his royal court fleeing the capital. Once in Beijing, those Anglo-French forces looted and burned the old summer palace in an act of revenge for the arrest, torture and execution of the British diplomatic mission. Prince Gong, the younger half-brother of the emperor who had remained in Beijing as his brother's proxy, was forced to sign the Convention of Beijing, where the emperor, humiliated, died at Rehe, the imperial hunting lodge, the following year. Self-strengthening and frustration of reforms. The Xianfeng Emperor's death in 1861 saw the accession of the 5-year-old Tongzhi Emperor, a period in which the Qing rallied. During the Tongzhi Restoration, Han Chinese officials stood behind the Manchus as Zheng Guofan, in alliance with Prince Gong, sponsored the rise of young officials such as Li Hongzhang, who helped the Qing set back on its feet financially and instituted the self-strengthening movement. This was an adoption of Western military technology while preserving Confucian values. These initiated reforms enabled foreign diplomats to live in Beijing, established the Imperial Maritime Customs Service, installed a modern navy and army, and the purchase of armament factories from Europe. However, despite these successes, the dynasty gradually lost control of its peripheral territories. In return for promises of support against the British and French, the Russian Empire took large chunks of territory in the northeast in 1860. The period of cooperation between those reformers and the European powers ended in 1870 with the Tianjin massacre, an incident that was incited by the murder of French nuns after belligerence of local French diplomats. This era also saw the rise of power of Empress Dowager Cixi. Cixi entered the imperial palace in the 1850s as a concubine of the Xianfeng Emperor, before later becoming the mother of the future Tongzhi Emperor. Following the accession of the Tongzhi Emperor at the age of 5, Cixi, Xianfeng's widow, Empress Dowager Xian, and Prince Gong, a son of the Daoguang Emperor, staged a coup that ousted several of the Tongzhi Emperor's regents. From 1861 to 1873, Cixi and Xian served as regents together, and following the emperor's death in 1875, Cixi's nephew, the Guangxu Emperor, took the throne in violation of the custom that new emperor be of the next generation and the next regency begins. When Xian died suddenly in the spring of 1881, Cixi became the sole regent. Guangxu began to rule in his own right from 1889 until 1898. The Empress Dowager lived in semi-retirement, spending the majority of her time in the summer palace. In 1897, 2 German Roman Catholic missionaries were murdered in Shandong province in what became known as the Juya Incident. Germany used this as a pretext for naval occupation of Jiaozhou Bay. This occupation prompted a scramble for China in 1898, which, in addition to the Germans leasing Jiaozhou Bay, there was a Russian leasing of Liaodong, the British leasing the new territories in Hong Kong, and the French leasing Guangzhou. In the wake of these events, the Guangxu Emperor initiated the 100 Days Reform in 1898. A series of new edicts and plans were introduced to reorganize the bureaucracy, restructure the school system, and appoint new officials. Although she had been involved in the initial reforms, the Empress Dowager stepped in to call them off. She arrested and executed several reformers and took over the day-to-day control of the new policies. Drought in northern China, combined with the imperialist designs of the European powers and the instability of the Qing government, all created the conditions for the Boxer movement to flourish. In the year 1900, local groups of Boxers, while proclaiming support for the Qing Dynasty, murdered foreign missionaries and Chinese Christians before converging on Beijing to besiege the Foreign Legation Quarter. A coalition of European, Japanese and Russian armies, known as the Eight-Nation Alliance, then entered China, without diplomatic authority, as Cixi declared war on those nations as the Qing lost control of Beijing after a short but hard-fought campaign which saw the imperial government fleeing to the safety of Xi'an. The victorious allies then enforced their demands on the Qing government, which included compensation for their expenses while invading China and the execution of officials found to be complicit in Boxer Protocol. Conclusion: a time of reform, revolution, and eventual collapse. The defeat by Japan in 1895 created a series of crises, which the failure of the 1898 reforms and the disasters of 1900 only exacerbated. In 1901, Cixi moved to mollify the foreign community, calling for reform proposals and initiating the late Qing reforms. Over the following few years, those reforms included the restructuring of the national education, judicial and fiscal systems, with the most dramatic being the abolition of the imperial examination system in 1905. The imperial court directed a constitution to be drafted with provincial elections taking place, the first in China's long history. Sun Yat-sen and revolutionaries debated with reform officials over how to transform the Manchu-ruled empire into a modernized Han Chinese state. Then, on the 14th of November 1908, the Guangxu Emperor died, followed by the death of Empress Dowager Cixi the following day. Puyi, the oldest son of Zaifeng, Prince of Chun, and nephew to the childless Guangxu Emperor, was appointed his successor. Puyi, at the age of 2, meant Zaifeng was given the role of regent. Zaifeng forced Yuan Shikai to resign as the Qing Dynasty became a constitutional monarchy on the 8th of May 1911. Zaifeng created a responsible cabinet led by Yi Quan, Prince Qing, which later became known as the Royal Cabinet, as 5 of the 13 members were part of or related to the royal family. The Wuchang Uprising on the 10th of October 1911 set off a series of uprisings which led to 14 of the 22 provinces rejecting Qing rule by the following month. This led to the creation of the Republic of China in Nanjing on the 1st of January 1912, with Sun Yat-sen as its leader. Seeking a desperate situation, the Qing court returned Yuan Shikai to power with his Beiyang army, crushing the revolutionaries in Wuhan at the Battle of Yangxia. After taking the position of Prime Minister, Yuan created his own government with the support of Empress Dowager Long Yu. Yuan Shikai then decided to cooperate with Sun Yat-sen's revolutionaries to overthrow the Qing dynasty. On February 12, 1912, Long Yu issued the abdication of the child Emperor Puyi, which led to the fall of the Qing dynasty. This brought an end to more than 2,000 years of imperial rule in China and began a period of instability. In July 1917, there was an abortive attempt to restore the Qing dynasty led by Zhang Shun. This resulted in Puyi being allowed to live in the Forbidden City until his abdication in 1924, when he moved to the Japanese concession in Tianjin. The Empire of Japan invaded northeast China and founded Manchukuo in 1932, with Puyi as its emperor. After invasion of northeast China by the Soviet Union to remove Japan, Manchukuo fell in 1945. That brings us to the end of this video, highlighting a historical era that has helped shape China today. If you've enjoyed watching and it's shown you a little detail of life and events here in China, then your subscribing to my channel would mean a lot to me. Thank you for watching. Make sure you click on the link to the next video, and until the next time, goodbye for now.